When I was a kid, we had a pretty bland set of recreation activities, I guess, but we thought it was fun to get on our bicycles and pedal as far as we were allowed to, I guess, and count the planes going overhead from Midway Airport. We thought that was great fun. And certainly when we were kids, we never imagined that one of those planes would bomb one of us. And yet, I suppose in part because of having been with a group of Muslim students 2 nights ago in Birmingham, Alabama, and wanting to reassure, in a sense, the students that I knew, that others in the audience knew, that it's not the case that Muslims have the market cornered on violent or bloody actions. And so I started to recite some of the history of French involvement in slaughter, World War I, World War II, the battles of Algeria, Indochina, the development of nuclear weaponry. And certainly as we go over our own sad, sorry history of wars, it certainly is the case that the planes seem always to come. And I've been so fortunate to be again and again with people who take an uncompromising, radical, strong stand against the wars. And so I just want to give you a latest incarnation of that, I suppose. Voices has a tendency to do ordeal-oriented long projects. I'm with Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and when it's blistering hot, we'll be walking through cornfields on a 3-week walk, or when it's freezing cold, we'll be out having a vigil. So we were walking through Iowa, which has so much to recommend it, but it can get a bit boring, kind of flat as a pancake. And we were walking to a place where drones would be operated out of the Des Moines Air National Guard base, and with a New Yorker who's got a very fertile mind, Luke Nephew. So Luke Nephew and I, walking along, started to make up a song. I'll just offer it for you now. I spy, what do you spy? Drone overhead with a camera eye. I spy, okay, tell me, drone's got a weapon in its belly. I spy, I might die. I am a victim of a lie. I am 16, I might die. I am a victim of a lie. And so it goes. Young people in other parts of the world, sometimes stiffening and finding it very hard to fall asleep at all because the unmanned aerial vehicles are flying overhead and could be targeting them as a possible suspect by virtue of their age and the fact that they're young men. So I would like to tell you a little bit more about why it is that those of us who've been going back and forth to Afghanistan, and then also hope they will have more participation in later when there are others who've been to Iraq much more recently than me, Kathy Breen, Tom Facey, Gabe Huck, for instance, could chime in. But why it is that we believe that the United States has been marketing wars by trying to pretend that the wars have made some kind of humanitarian gains, that that's a marketing ploy, and why it is that we believe that the United States markets the wars by trying to claim successes that simply cannot be substantiated, cannot be supported as anything close to a success. Jens Stoltenberg, with the NATO forces, the new head of NATO, had gone over to Afghanistan, and he said that things are better now for women and children. And so I wished that he could have come with me when I was in Afghanistan most recently. I call them the women who don't go away. These are the women who know that where I've been staying with the Afghan peace volunteers, they have a very good project, and that is to make big, heavy blankets. It's so cold in Afghanistan. In January of 2011, 28 people in Kabul alone had frozen to death by the end of January, and 8 of them were children. The weather is very, very cold and harsh, but a big, heavy blanket can actually make the difference between life and death. And so our young Afghan friends started organizing so that they could invite women who could not feed their children, women who sometimes would come to us and say things like, I think I'm losing my mind. I feel that I'm going insane. I think I'm emotionally disturbed. And when we'd ask, what's wrong, Shakira? Why are you saying that, Samia? Please tell us more, Fatima. It was always the same. I can't feed my children. And then when we'd ask, well, what do you have in the home? There would be almost a sense of guilt, and the woman would look down and say, stale bread and tea without sugar. I know little trash collectors who, after we scoop up our waste, and I know what's in that waste, it's waste, they ask, can we go through it? And then they pull out the crumbs of stale bread and bits of paper that they might be able to use for fuel. So the women who won't go away are the ones who know that maybe they could be invited to make these heavy blankets and be paid a minimal wage. Or maybe they could receive one of the blankets. But of course, you can't give a blanket to everybody. You can't pay a minimal wage to everybody. And so some people are left out. And the most enterprising thing those women can do, many of them widows, who get pushed up the mountainside, because the higher up the mountain you go, the less likelihood you'll get any water at all. And then it's very difficult because there's no running water. The latrines don't have water. So you have to come all the way down the mountain, get water in a jug, carry it back up the mountain. These women want to preserve their children through the cold winter. Some of them live in miserable refugee camps. I remember recently being in one of those camps during a winter time, and a man flicked a blanket that was over a kind of a tarp, and that was the shelter with poles holding it up. And he asked me, do you think that we like to live this way? I'm sure you don't. So those women that won't go away will sit right down in the doorway, and they won't leave, and sometimes the woman will start to cry and pound her breast. And you can't tell them to leave. You can't give them the answer they want. And so I wish that the NATO Chief of Staff, the many, many generals, the many State Department people would just come and sit with the women who won't go away.
They wouldn't care.
It could be. And in a way, I can also tell you about the generals who won't go away. $53 billion this year for Afghanistan, and we're supposed to think that the war is ending, right? $53 billion, $2.1 million per soldier per year. This is what the United States is spending. Now, in all these years since 2001 of expenditures, you might think that the United States military, one of the largest, most formidable militaries in the world, would have gotten the upper hand over, say, the Taliban or various drug lords or warlords by now. 70% of Afghanistan, the same amount of land mass that was in the hands of the Taliban in 2001, is now controlled by anti-government forces, many of them Taliban, many of them drug lords. The Taliban had eradicated the opium crops. The heroin trade was over under the Taliban in 2002. Now, 80 to 90% of the world's opium is coming from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is the world's largest exporter of marijuana. The children can't eat opium. The children can't eat marijuana. At least 500,000 children in those southern provinces where the US and the UK forces were so concentrated, in Helmand, in Kandahar. 500,000 children suffering from severe acute malnourishment. You never recover if you continue to live from severe acute malnourishment. And chronic brain deficiency is one of the major problems that goes with that terrible and tortuous disease. Maybe a measure of good news. The chronic brain deficiency could be offset if a child's diet includes iodine. So iodization of the children's food could help a child overcome chronic brain deficiency when the child is starving. And even better news in a sense, the cost to get that iodine into the diet of a child would be 5 cents per child per year. Could we imagine Lady Justice and the scales? On one scale, $2.1 million to keep a United States soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year. And let's not forget that when the soldiers come back, every single day, 22 combat veterans commit suicide. So that's one side of the scale. On the other side, 5 cents to help a child overcome chronic brain deficiency. What do you think your neighbors, your relatives, your friends, strangers you meet on the street would choose? And why can't United States people know such choices? But instead, what the media will feed to us again and again and again is completely subservient to the idea of the guys in uniform that are coming back with their buttons shining and their heroic deeds done, the women they've saved, the schools they've built, the children that are now educated, the girls that are now... It's just not true, but it plays well. It's not true because now, between the ages of 15 and 24, 20% of young women in Afghanistan are literate. What kind of a big success story is that? It's not true because it's still the case that 1 out of every 11 women in Afghanistan dies in childbirth. It's not true that things are better because even in Kabul, women and girls are still being sold in marriage and still being kept under the thumb of repressive cultures. And so when the United States wants to make these claims that somehow in a humanitarian way the United States has improved the lives of women and children in Afghanistan, this is a marketing ploy. But this war is no better than the previous wars going back to as long as you might like to go, but certainly when we look at Vietnam, any of the wars after World War II, including in Iraq. And I'd like to say something further about Iraq. Kathy Breen and Gabe Huck and Tom Fazy and I are people who've gone back and forth to Iraq with some regularity. For me, not so much recently. But I had been in Iraq all through the shock and awe bombing along with Kathy Breen. And that's Kathy right there. After that bombing was over, and it was shocking, and it was awful, Kathy and I and others would try to go at least to Amman, Jordan, and see if we could go back into Iraq and perhaps be of some use, bringing goodwill and a measure of support and some kind of help to people who were becoming refugees, displaced from their own homes or being displaced into nearby neighboring countries. And so at one point we were in Jordan, and a group of youngsters came, and they asked me, when you go into Iraq, could you try to find our friends in prison? Because we can't, and we were in that prison ourselves, and it was a terrible place, and we think we got out because we spoke English, and they didn't really want us in the prison anymore. But maybe you could go and find out how our friends, their families are frantic for them. Well, it seemed like a pretty tall order. The prison was south of Basra, which is the southernmost city in Iraq, and how in the world would we get there, and why would the U.S. military let us in, and how would we know if these youngsters were still in that? But who could say no? So we started trying to put the pieces together, and fortunately our friends in the Christian Peacemaker team so bravely had been stationing themselves outside of various prisons in Baghdad and asking the relatives going to pay visits, do you want us to try to follow up on your relative? If so, give us the capture tag number or the name, the information. And then they would very politely go to the U.S. military and continue trying to build their database so that ultimately they had a database and they knew where 6,000 prisoners were, and they could follow them when they were being transferred. And it was really their information that Seymour Hersh used when he wrote about Abu Ghraib. So they gave us their database. We looked for the names, and we found one of the friends that these young men wanted us to look into. And they said, well, in that prison, ask for Major Garrity. So off we went with a trusted friend and driver, bumping across desert sands in one of the most bleak and godforsaken areas I've ever entered into. The sand was kind of blackened. We were spitting flies out of our mouths. It was blazing hot. Got there to this tent encampment that looked so primitive and found out they had visiting hours and visiting days, and we had just missed visiting day Tuesday, and the next visiting day was Saturday. Well, the one asset I do bring to the peace movement is an extraordinary ability to look helpless. NTM! So Major Garrity did come out to see us, and she had mercy on us. I think she thought we were telling the truth. We had come a long way. So she put us in the back of a Jeep, and we were driven to the innards of this very primitive tent encampment prison. And there, because we had the brother of one of the prisoners with us, I witnessed one of the most tender, loving embraces possible. These two brothers reunited, however briefly, and he translated for us. And everything that these young men in the Buka compound told us corroborated what I'd been told by their friends who were already released. So I tend to believe they were telling the truth. When you enter into the Buka compound, there are two big posters of the Twin Towers ablaze. And Joe Buka was a firefighter from New York who was killed on September 11th. And so the communication is that somehow this prison tent encampment, which was so beleaguered, so awful a place that I wouldn't wish it on any soldier as a guard. I wouldn't wish it on Major Garrity. I certainly wouldn't wish it on the prisoners themselves. That this was a trade-off that would somehow make people secure in light of September 11th. And when we talked to the young men, they told us that at times they had been forced to strip naked and were paraded maybe to get a shower in front of United States women military. And that was a huge humiliation for any Muslim man. Sometimes they had to beg for their food, holding up a bowl and barking like a dog. And at other times they had to say, "I love George Bush," just to get food in their bowl. Now this isn't per se torture, but you can imagine the humiliation, the resentment. Sometimes when it was cold, they were out on the ground without blankets, and they would try to dig holes in the sand to get warm, but they were afraid of desert scorpions that might bite them. And there were two 13-year-olds in the prison, 13-year-old Iraqis, juveniles, and they were trying to protect the 13-year-olds from some thuggish prisoners that wanted to prevail on them. And so they spilled out all of these stories. No one had come to visit them. They didn't know if their families knew if they were alive or dead. They didn't know what they were charged with, but they had heard that it could be many months, maybe years, before they would ever, if you just did the math, go before a military tribunal, because they only came once a week, and they only saw about 3 people in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, and the prison was very overcrowded. Ali al-Baghdadi, who is the self-styled caliph of what he calls the caliphate, is somebody who did his recruitment, he says, while he was for at least 4 years imprisoned in the Buka compound. 500,000 children under Saddam Hussein were also, I believe, tortured to death. Because when you die from starvation, it's a terrible, terrible way to die. It's essentially because of asphyxiation. When the little juices ran out of their bodies because of gastroenteritis, when they contracted respiratory infections, when they had combinations of those kinds of curable, simple diseases, they didn't stand a chance. I remember being with a nurse from the United Kingdom, Martin Thomas, sitting in a ward with mothers cross-legged, each of them holding her infant, and each one of them knowing that she would never leave the hospital with her baby alive. And Martin looked around and he said, I think I understand. It's a death row for infants, isn't it? A death row for infants. And I believe that every single one of those children very likely had a brother, a father, a cousin, an uncle, someone with a grievance, someone with a very serious grievance. And what about the people who experienced the 2003 shock and awe bombing and maybe had also been traumatized in the 1991 bombing or the briefer but very vicious 1998 bombing? What about the fact that now today in Iraq 1 out of 4 people suffers from hunger, according to the United Nations? What about the people whose businesses are destroyed, whose future dreams can't come true because they aren't able to pursue professions? What about the people whose families have been broken apart? And so, yes, there might be people who might feel they have as much of a grievance that would compel them to pick up a gun as some youngster in the United States who maybe didn't do so well in school, or maybe couldn't find a job, or maybe wanted to get beyond the small town, or maybe wanted some adventure, and maybe doesn't know anything about Iraq, or Afghanistan, or possibly Syria, or possibly Iran, but enlists. Last week, I was with people wearing orange jumpsuits, and we put the black bag over our heads. And that was the uniform that we chose to wear, knowing it would only be temporary. We would take that hood off. But we wanted to try to identify with the people in Guantanamo, many of whom were held without charge now for as long as 13 years, many of whom didn't do anything more or maybe less than what United States youngsters have done, going off for military training, sometimes in their high schools, sometimes in their colleges, sometimes at camps, getting ready to pick up guns and loan themselves to possibly kill or be killed. But we've been told in the United States that if somebody is wearing a uniform and is protecting our security, then we must exalt that person, glorify that person, regard that person instantly as a heroic policeman or a heroic soldier. It's not rational. It's not inherently truthful. But it seems so impolite to speak up about that matter in this country today, even though we know we're moving closer and closer to fascism. I never would have said this a year ago, but I can't refrain from saying it now, because fascism focuses on the people who are new immigrants, or people of color, or people who are not considered to be part of the mainstream, the in group, and begins to say that they're the reason, they're the cause of the problem. And we're seeing that increasingly today. And so I believe we need the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King rather desperately. And in his Beyond Vietnam speech, the Reverend Dr. King issued an extraordinary and astonishing challenge. It rolls off the tongue now to think of the Reverend Dr. King asking people back in the late 60s to love the Viet Cong. He wanted people to love their enemies, to see themselves as they're seen by the so-called enemy, and to see the humanity of the so-called enemy. But when we try that on in our propagandized situation, it doesn't roll off the tongue to say, how can we better love Al-Qaeda? How can we better love the Taliban? How can we better love the IS, Islamic State? It's not so easy to ask, how can we see the humanity of the people who beheaded James Foley, Stephen Sutloff, David Haynes? How can we better understand how we're seen by people that are fighting with the Taliban? Well, I want to pause for a moment and just acknowledge that I was in Afghanistan over the summer, living in a place where we had electricity every other day sporadic access to the internet, certainly no newspaper. If there was news coming over the radio, I didn't understand it. Nevertheless, I somehow knew the names of the people who were beheaded, the US people that were beheaded in Syria. Why did I know those names? Because 94% of the US public knew those stories of those beheadings. The media wanted us to know, to feel, to have visceral reactions. But when I try to even myself recall the names of any of the 500,000 children who died because of economic sanctions, those names don't come so easily. And the names of the other people who can't escape our wars, who are so very, very trapped, those names are not supposed to be part of our literacy. So I would like to say that I think one of the most important things for all of us is to become literate in the stories of the people who cannot escape our wars, to become literate in their stories to the best of our abilities, and sometimes it means pushing out beyond what's handed to us in the mainstream media. As we know, that media is so very, very dominated by people who want to keep on being war profiteers, who hold such a stake, such an economic stake, in the continuation of war after war after war. And the 21st century military is going to involve not so much the sprawling big US military bases, but rather a combination, as we saw in Afghanistan when right after the new president came into power, he swiftly signed the bilateral security agreement saying yes to drone attacks, yes to night raids. And so the surveillance drones, as much as the killer drones, can target people for assassinations, can purportedly identify who the villains are in this cartoonized version of foreign policy with good guys and bad guys. Who are the villains? Well, the Reprieve organization in the UK says that they don't get it right. It's pernicious, I want to say, to ever talk about a surgical strike. Surgery is a term that should connote healing and helping people. But anyway, the Reprieve organization says that in Yemen and in Somalia, for every one person that was targeted for assassination, 28 additional people were killed. Their report was called "You Only Die Once," because some people have been listed 3 times as having been killed in the registries of the United States military. So we have so much to learn, so much to do, so much to try to understand during this time when all around the country people will be listening to the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think that's a very, very good thing. I'll close on a somewhat lighter note, maybe a more wry note. And some of you may have heard Charlie King sing songs. He's in his 70s now. He's a very good songwriter, singer. So if Charlie King in his 70s can manage this, I'll try it in my 62nd year of life. This is about drones, and I think you'll know the tune. Isn't it strange? Aren't we a pair? One of us safe on the ground, one in mid-air. Which is the drone? Never leave home, never ask why. One rolls a joystick around, one gets to fly. Which is the drone? Hundreds are killed, thousands are maimed. Digitized dolls on a screen, no faces, no names. Finish my 4-hour shift, and I find I'm alone, far from the fray. Address unknown. Don't give your name. Feel no regret. Ask not for whom the bell tolls,
fire and forget. Only a drone, a defensible drone, no problem yet. Isn't it strange? Isn't it queer? Terror remotely controlled a pilot's career. Where are the drones? Why are there drones? Is anyone there? What kind of a death wish? What kind of a death wish, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King asked, would a society make to so prioritize its values that it would want war over ending human suffering? And so the drones won't give us the intelligence we need to do that, but I see in this room plenty of intelligence, plenty of dedication, plenty of commitment. We catch courage from one another, and I believe that the civil rights movement had it right. One day we shall overcome. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions for Kathy.
Why am I going to prison? I think that the system in this country is very, very flawed. But we can try still to go before the executive branch, go before the legislative branch, and go before the judicial branch of government and bring our grievances. It's a protected constitutional right. You don't get freedom. It doesn't just plop in your lap. You have to take it. Now, we don't have a very easy time of it in the courts in this country trying to exercise our protected First Amendment right to assemble peaceably for redress of grievance. It made all the sense in the world, for me particularly, after listening to kids in Afghanistan talk about how they can't go back and visit their families because it's too dangerous, because of airborne attacks, because of airstrikes. After I've heard them talk about an in-law that was killed by a drone, his body blasted to smithereens, the young man's mother asked me, why did they kill my son? She went to the authorities and they told her there were doubts, there were suspicions. She was livid. You don't kill somebody based on a doubt, on a suspicion. I've been in Pakistan and have listened to people when I've said to them, do you think ever you would sit down with us and talk with people from my country? And the man had just told me about a drone attack on his village of 500 people, told me about how they'd had to try to scoop up the survivors, and there weren't any roads. They were running through fields. They were covered with blood. They were trying to wrap up the people's wounds with their own long scarves. And when I asked him, would he ever talk to people from my country, he said, oh, madame. He looked at me like I was crazy. Who would be so crazy ever as to not to want the peace? Of course we would talk with you. Just, madame, please, you leave the weapons aside. Just, madame, please, you leave the weapons aside. I had good reason to go to that base and talk to the commander. I carried a loaf of bread, wanting to represent my friend in Pakistan, wanting to represent the Afghan peace volunteers who shared bread with me morning, noon, and night in their home, and who very rarely would get more than bread and rice and maybe noodles in many of their meals. I wanted to bring that bread to that commander and ask him, how many drone strikes did your base enact today? Was anybody killed? Was anybody wounded or maimed? Were any houses destroyed or other buildings? I wanted to ask him, how does your manual help the trainees distinguish between a combatant and a non-combatant? And anyway, I wanted to let him know that again and again people in Afghanistan tell me, we don't know who is Taliban and who isn't. So how do your people 8,000 feet above in the air over in another country figure it out? I wanted to know, what kind of services do they have when somebody says, I can't do this anymore, and is feeling post-traumatic stress, never having left the base, but because of the nature of the job.
when they track somebody day after day after day. And then maybe what they most know about that person is the man is a good family man because they see him pick up his kids and swing them around. I wanted to raise all those questions, have a conversation, bring my grievance there. But 1 foot over the line and we were apprehended and told to go back. And I said very politely, I'm sorry, but because of the way that the land on this base is being used, I think your authority has been usurped and also that of your commander. Well, I might as well have been speaking in another language. He looked at me. So I was arrested. And I also believe it's very, very important to reckon with another war that doesn't get as much play in the United States, but it happens every day, and that's the war against the poor, against impoverished people here in the United States. And where do people who are impoverished, underserved, often getting the worst of the education, shut out of the economy, in a pipeline if they're very young and in certain neighborhoods, directly to the jails, where do they go? When prosecutors, 97% of the cases tried are plea bargains. They don't even get to trial. The prosecutor, in 2012, the average length of sentence for somebody who said, I want that trial, was 16 years. The average length of sentence for people who accepted a plea bargain and said, okay, we won't go to trial, forget it, I'll just take whatever you give me in the plea bargain, was 5 years, 4 months. So we've got at least 1.7 million, possibly as many as 2 million, depending on how you count it, people in the United States locked up in prisons. And it's like a world of imprisoned beauty. I've been in maximum security for a 1-year sentence. I've been in minimum security before in lots of county jails. I don't know where they keep the bad sisters. I never met them. Forget Orange is the New Black. It's very exaggerated and kind of sensationalized. But I met women who longed to be with their children, who felt a stigma, who showed enormous courage, enormous courage. I don't know where they get it from. You know, you'd see a woman end a phone call with her loved ones, and you could feel the lump in her throat, and she'd hang up the phone, tears staining her cheeks, her eyes red, and she'd do a hairpin turn into the bathroom, into the shower, and then come out having found the courage to face the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the rest of the month, the rest of the year, the rest of the years. Kept away from children, from family, from a meaningful life. And across the way, the last time I was locked up in a women's prison that was minimum security, on the other side of the road was the medium to high security prison for men. And the median sentence length was 27 years. We'd watch young men shackled at their ankles, manacled with their hands and their ankles and their hands chained together, stumbling off the bus. And those young men will be grandfathers when they leave the prison. So I've got no doubt but that it's time for me to go into a prison with my mouth shut, basically, and my eyes and ears open. I hope I make friends, but it's mostly important to listen, to really try to listen and maybe be a vehicle for the stories of some of the people whose stories should be part of our literature that we become more literate about. 90 million people were killed in World Wars I and II. Bloodshed, the torture, the short-sightedness, the ruination, the devastation, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the wars against peoples in Central America. There's this long, sordid, bloody, terrible, burdensome history. And it gets eclipsed. For myself, probably the greatest disappointment, Tom, in my adult life was that we did not lift those economic sanctions one day sooner than when the United States was ready to lift them, because now the United States was the occupying power. And even then,
they didn't fully lift the economic sanctions against Iraq. I feel a bit of resignation to just accept that it's a history that will largely go untold. But I think that's our job, it's our work, and it's a meaningful work, to try to hold up the truth and do it in light of what Howard Zinn held out as a tremendous hope that one day we might see the changing of the guard, that the people who are not in high elite places are not part of the 1%, who are charged with guarding the system, sometimes carrying a gun, wearing a uniform to guard the system, sometimes practicing as lawyers to guard the system, that grouping of people charged with guarding the system might themselves someday say, it's too rotten. We can't any longer do it. I take great hope from having visited a youngster in the Chicago Cook County Jail, a gulag, a horrible place, and he said that coming down the tier was a guard who had Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, tucked under his arm. And my young friend said, I can't keep my mouth shut. I asked him, how do you do this? How do you keep doing this job when you're reading her book? And they've started a conversation, and those kinds of conversations are very, very important. It's very grassroots, but I think those conversations could one day, maybe with the next generation or a next generation, make a difference. And also, I think the terror of what we're doing to our own environment is beginning to dawn on people increasingly. And if we can pull together the peace movement and the environmental movement, then I think numbers will rise and passions will kind of cross-fertilize. It's interesting to me that more money has been spent in Afghanistan on non-military aid than in all of the Marshall Plan put together. $104 billion since 1991 has been spent on non-military aid to Afghanistan. The last time I was over there, we had electricity every other day, no running water indoors, and I was better off than most. The Special Inspector General in Afghanistan report has a quarterly report that tells about the corruption and the ways in which very little of this money ever reached the poorest, the neediest people all across Afghanistan. One of the biggest spikes in the graph for money that was spent was on counter-narcotics. Well, they didn't do very well, did they? Another big, huge expenditure went toward eliminating corruption from governance. But Afghanistan came out on Transparency International 1 year ago as tying with Somalia and North Korea as the most corrupt government in the world. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And yet they are willing to say what a success the war in Afghanistan was. At least in Britain, the generals are saying it was not only a defeat, it was a disgrace. Now they're sad that it wasn't a good war because they would like to have a nice war, a good war come along, and I'm against any war myself. But I think the calumny, the level of lying that the United States engages in and tries to put over on the US people is sometimes, it stretches the imagination. I was born on third base. Working class family. My father was a Catholic school teacher. It wasn't like we had a lot of money, but we never ever worried about where the next meal was going to come from. It's a sinister and a kind of a sick scandal that anyone in this country, there are 58,000 homeless people in New York, 20,000 of them are children. It's a scandal that this should exist while we're throwing billions and trillions so that the Pentagon can go and make people homeless in other countries. So I won't put up with it. I have to put myself in the middle of this military system, and whomever might be harmed by that system still further, even though it's symbolic, even though it's just minute, absolutely minute, it is a measure for sanity. And so I'm claiming my own right for sanity. I do think a lot about Eric Garner, and when I think about people that could be annihilated by the firing of a drone as they're walking down a road in Afghanistan, well, Eric Garner was standing on a street corner in New York, and his last words, "I can't breathe." Michael Brown, maybe a traffic violation walking down the middle of the street. So it is this idea of, well, you might be threatened, and you don't want your children to be threatened, right? You don't want your grandchildren to be threatened. So you need the people in uniform to protect you. But as Catherine said, it's not protection. It's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot again and again and again. Because we don't have the resources, the ingenuity, the funding, the cooperation from other countries to tackle the very real terrors that we are facing in terms of global warming, climate change, depletion of resources, pollution of the air, the ground, the water. But I think younger people are starting to catch on to this. And 2 nights ago I was in Birmingham, Alabama, and I thought, uh-oh, who is going to come and hear Medea Benjamin and me in Birmingham, Alabama? Over 100 people. There was standing room only, and about half the audience were young, and many of them were young Muslim students. Yeah, I was happy about that. Let's hear from a young person here. So.
Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Javier. I'm 26. Thank you so much for what you do. I was 2 years ago. I was former military police for the Marine Corps, and I acknowledge every single word that you said. On top of more things, 1984 was written in 1948, and what's happening right now with this generation is that they're becoming immune to the collective psychosis that we have been imprinted upon for so long. We have been told that this is something that needs to be done, and now we're becoming immune to it. But my generation is coming to the point that's, what do I do? There's so much corruption, there's so much things to be done, and we're like, oh my God. And it's not really about oil, but it's really more about the collective psychosis instilled on our family structure, on our families, because we're not able to speak to each other. The generations can't even communicate with each other without calling each other sheep, without being a global unity of cohesion of humanity. So I have, I'll share this with my friends, and I have a lot of friends that are still in the military-industrial complex. I have a lot of friends back home that still support the enslavement of people, the prison industrial complex, because they call them criminals. I have a lot of friends that they still support this because the realization of it is not for oil, because we could dish out all of this. Human ingenuity is infinite. What it is about keeping our minds enslaved so we don't look for ulterior motives. So to all these people that are still working for the military industrial complex, to the correctional officers that I know that are still in the industrial complex, to my friends that are like, you're just a hippie, how can you possibly do this if you went through 5 years of this? Don't you feel any honor in it? I feel more honor in meeting people like you who actually do the actual work and breathe the dust without a paycheck. What do you have to say to them, and what can we do as a cohesive humanity, regardless of the age range, to get these people that culturally indoctrinate us systematically for over hundreds of years out of power?
Well, thank you, Javier. Javier, I hope you'll get in touch with the Peace Poets of Brooklyn, Luke Nephew and Ralph Lopez, the Peace Poets in Brooklyn. You can Google them, and they're right here in New York, and you sound like them, you look like them, and they would love to meet you. Also, on the 21st of every month, my young friends in Afghanistan host a Skype phone call, and it's interesting. They talk with young people from other parts of the world, including young people in Gaza, or in Iraq, or in sometimes displaced, been living in some place like in Australia. And it's very interesting to hear young people swap notes about how to survive in war zones. So it reminds me that we're, 6% of the world's population?
5, I think.
5, yeah. We're snarfing down 30 to 40% of the world's resources. That's a conservative estimate. But all around the world, there are people who would like to see the minority opinions here supported and help them grow roots and grow fast. So I think we are not as alone as we might sometimes think, or as marginalized as we might sometimes think when we think globally of how many people are waiting to heave this structure over. The sun set on the British Empire. I think the sun will set on this empire,
My commitment is to try to help that happen with the nonviolent means at our disposal. I really believe in those. I believe nonviolence can change the world. I also believe if we make the poorest among us our number one priority, that becomes our number one priority, a lot of other things make sense and fall into place. But you're so right. The military, industrial, media, congressional, prison, industrial complex has a gajillion ways to distract us. You're supposed to be interested in the Emmys. You're supposed to be interested in the football season. You're supposed to be paying attention to, your shopping chores. And, the national religion is like shopping. And there are so many ways in which we get distracted from paying attention to how we might reasonably live our lives in accord with what we really believe. Most people don't believe in killing people. Check them out. Ask your neighbors, you believe in killing people? Most people don't believe in killing people. But when it's wholesale slaughter, we say, oh, okay, how much do you want us to pay? It doesn't make any sense. The Occupy movement, to me, accomplished something remarkable. In 12 weeks, that logo, 99 in 1, was globalized. In 12 weeks, some of us have spent the better part of an adult lifetime trying to get that idea out, amongst 12 people. And there it went global. So you can't know exactly where genius will be born, exactly when a moment might become a movement. A part of our job is to be ready. In the past, I've met women who were really, like the women I know in Afghanistan, unable to meet their children's basic needs. My child needs glasses for school. My child needs gym shoes. My child needs gloves, a warm coat. I'm working part-time. I don't have a way to get to work or get home from work. The light bill isn't paid. I'm going nuts. I've got to do something, and my brother wants me to be the lookout and look out the window because he's enacting drug deals down at the corner, and he'll give me a cut, and I need the money. Well, that is the story of how so many people get woven into some very, very bad practices. I don't want to justify what happens in the drug trades. I do want to say that decriminalizing the drug laws, decriminalizing drugs, would be a huge step toward an answer. Now, every university across this country graduates every year a new crop of lawyers. What are you going to do with all those lawyers? How are you going to keep them all employed? Prisons, criminals.
Give them brooms.
Give them brooms. So it's a setup. You've got the architects that build the prisons making money, the corporations that use the prison labor. So who would I rather be with? Who do you think I'd rather be with? The fat cats that are making money off of this system and acting like they're plantation overlords and pushing us more toward fascism, or the women I'm remembering right now, Lorraine, Marlo, Connie, Ruth. I would far rather be with those women and try to understand more about their children and what they see as good means for raising children. And a lot of them are visionaries, and once they get the drugs out of their system and go through detox, you're looking at, I will say it again, a world of imprisoned beauty. The guards know it, the warden knows it. Everybody knows that the system is flawed and wrongful and cruel and merciless. But ask me who I want to be with? I would, believe me, I would, door number 1, door number 2, put me in jail. Back in 1988, when I had a lot to learn, the women in prison taught me. And they gave me a good dose of political education. Some of it was so funny that my side would hurt. It was uproarious to listen, but they understood the system. They didn't need me to tell them anything. And if I could write even a portion of the colorful and interesting and often humorous narrative that goes on as I listen, I'd be really pleased. A lot of the guards in the rural areas are young people who once upon a time would have been farming the land, but there's not land to farm. So they're young people who can't get jobs and don't have great educations, locking up
young people from the inner city who can't get jobs and don't have education. So it's kind of it's a crazy system, and the guards, they know it, they're not stupid. Many of the guards say that the prisons are so similar to their experiences in the military that they're almost interchangeable parts. If any of you ever come to Chicago, if it's in the near future, you might be able to get on my visiting list if I'm there, but you'd be welcome to pop into the Voices office. It's just a second floor apartment near the Argyle L stop, but you really would be welcome. People will vouch for me. You could come in and stay as long as you like, or take us over, or whatever. But it is a good, earnest group of people. We will continue to quietly send very small groups, sometimes as small as 1 or 2 people. Brian Terrell leaves to go to Afghanistan on the 22nd. We'll send people back and forth to Afghanistan and try to come back with reports. Kathy Breen has been so fine in keeping the channels open of communication with many, many people across Iraq. Tom Husar is part of the Voices staff there, but he's on loan to his beautiful family here in New York for the time being. Gabe Huck, without whom he and Teresa were the heart's beat of the Voices in the Wilderness campaign when we were trying to break the economic sanctions against Iraq. So please feel free to get to know us better. I put some literature over there. I do want to say, if you're ever feeling kind of down in the dumps and blah, and if you can get to a computer, do try to go to a website called ourjourneytosmile.com. I promise you it's not saccharine, it's not naive. It's the Afghan peace volunteers, these sturdy kids who refuse to give in to revenge and retaliation. And they've got 300 small videos, 3-minute videos, and they're cute. So thank you, all of you, and all good wishes to each of you. Bye now.